The True Story of Writing. Chapter 1. A World Without Writing. Every day, without even realizing it, we rely on writing. We read messages, road signs, books, and documents, trusting written words to organize nearly every part of our lives. Yet for most of human history, writing did not exist. Modern humans have lived on Earth for roughly 300,000 years, while writing appeared only about 5,300 years ago. For more than 98% of our existence, knowledge survived without a single written word. So how did people preserve information? How did they pass knowledge from one generation to the next? The answer was memory. Elders became the living libraries of their communities, preserving traditions, laws, and practical skills through storytelling. Every important event had to be remembered and repeated. But memory has limits. Stories changed, names were forgotten, and numbers became unreliable. For thousands of years, this was enough because communities were small. Then everything changed. Around 12,000 years ago, people in the Fertile Crescent began farming instead of constantly moving in search of food. Wheat and barley were cultivated, animals were domesticated, and permanent settlements appeared. Small villages gradually grew into the world's first cities. One of these cities was Uruk, located in southern Mesopotamia. By around 3400 BC, it had become one of the largest cities on Earth, with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Massive temples overlooked busy workshops, irrigation canals supplied fertile fields, and trade expanded every year. As the city grew, so did the amount of information that had to be managed. The temples were much more than religious buildings. They served as economic and administrative centers where crops were collected, goods were stored, and workers received their supplies. Officials needed accurate records. They had to know how much grain had been harvested, how many sheep belonged to the temple, how much food had been distributed, and who had paid taxes. Human memory alone could no longer handle such complexity. This challenge led to an extraordinary solution. Instead of writing words, the people of Mesopotamia began making small clay tokens. Each token represented a specific product. A cone could stand for a measure of grain, while a sphere might represent a sheep. Other shapes symbolized oil, livestock, or different agricultural goods. These simple objects became the world's earliest accounting system. For centuries, the method worked well. Every delivery and transaction could be recorded using physical tokens rather than memory alone. In many ways, these small pieces of clay were the distant ancestors of modern receipts and accounting records. However, as cities continued to expand, the number of tokens increased dramatically. Organizing and storing thousands of them became increasingly difficult. The system that had once solved a problem was creating a new one. No one realized it at the time, but humanity was standing on the threshold of one of its greatest inventions. There were still no books, no laws carved in stone, and no written stories. Yet the anonymous administrators of ancient Mesopotamia were unknowingly preparing the foundation for writing itself. Very soon, those simple clay tokens would evolve into marks pressed onto wet clay tablets. For the first time in history, information would exist outside the human mind. Knowledge would no longer disappear with the people who carried it. The invention of writing was about to begin, forever changing the course of civilization. The True Story of Writing. Chapter 2. From Clay tokens, to the first written symbols. Long before the first word was ever written, the people of ancient Mesopotamia had already begun searching for a better way to record information. Their solution was simple, yet remarkably effective. Instead of trusting memory alone, they relied on small objects made of clay. These objects, now known as clay tokens, appeared as early as 8000 BC. They came in many different shapes, each representing a specific commodity. A cone could stand for a measure of grain, while a sphere might represent a sheep. Other shapes symbolized jars of oil, livestock, or manufactured goods. Every token carried meaning without using a single written character. For thousands of years, this system became the foundation of trade throughout Mesopotamia. Farmers used tokens to represent the grain they delivered to temples. Merchants relied on them to track exchanges, and administrators recorded the growing wealth of their cities with these simple pieces of clay. As trade expanded, however, a new challenge emerged. The number of tokens increased dramatically. A single large transaction could require dozens or even hundreds of individual pieces. Organizing, transporting, and protecting them became increasingly difficult as cities continued to grow. To solve this problem, Mesopotamian administrators developed an ingenious invention known today as the bulla. A bulla was a hollow clay envelope. While the clay was still soft, the required tokens were placed inside and the envelope was carefully sealed. Once dried, it protected the contents from tampering and served as an official record of the transaction. If a disagreement occurred, the envelope could be broken open and the tokens counted again. It was one of humanity's earliest systems for securing financial records. Yet this solution had one obvious weakness. Every time someone wanted to verify the contents, the clay envelope had to be destroyed. Once opened, it could never be sealed again. The next idea would quietly transform human history. Instead of opening the envelope, administrators began pressing each clay token onto the soft outer surface before sealing it. The impressions clearly showed what was stored inside without breaking the seal. For the first time, information was represented by marks rather than by physical objects. This seemingly small improvement became one of the greatest turning points in the history of civilization. Eventually, people realized that the tokens themselves were no longer necessary. If an impression could represent a sheep or a measure of grain, then the token inside served little purpose. The envelope gradually disappeared, while the impressions remained. Scribes soon began pressing symbols directly onto flat clay tablets. Writing had begun. The earliest known tablets, discovered in the ancient city of Uruk, date to approximately 3400 to 3200 BC. Archaeologists identify this period as the Uruk IV phase, when some of the world's oldest written records first appeared. Surprisingly, these earliest texts were not stories, poems, or royal announcements. They were accounting records. Most contained simple lists of barley, sheep, beer, oil, dates, workers, and taxes. To modern readers, these records may appear ordinary, but they represent one of humanity's greatest achievements. For the first time, information could survive independently of human memory. The earliest symbols were pictographs. Each drawing closely resembled the object it represented. A fish looked like a fish, a jar resembled a jar, and a human head represented a person. Anyone familiar with the system could easily understand their meaning. As trade became more complex, however, drawing detailed pictures for every record became too slow. Over generations, scribes simplified these drawings into abstract signs that were faster to write and easier to recognize. Without realizing it, they were creating an entirely new system of communication. Their goal was not literature or philosophy. They simply wanted a faster and more reliable method of keeping records. Yet from these practical administrative marks would eventually emerge laws, scientific observations, religious texts, royal decrees, and some of the world's earliest works of literature. The invention of writing did not begin with a desire to tell stories. It began with the simple need to count, measure, and remember. Sometimes, the greatest revolutions in history begin with the smallest everyday problems. In ancient Mesopotamia, the challenge of managing trade gave humanity something far greater than an accounting system. It gave the world writing. The true story of writing. Chapter 3. The birth of cuneiform. Writing had finally begun, but it looked very different from the words we know today. The earliest symbols pressed into clay tablets were simple pictures representing grain, animals, tools, and people. At first glance, they resembled drawings more than a true writing system. Yet over the centuries, these humble marks would evolve into one of history's greatest inventions, cuneiform. The people responsible for this transformation were the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia. They worked inside temples and administrative centers, where nearly every aspect of city life depended on accurate records. Their task was not to create literature or tell stories. Instead, they counted harvests, tracked trade, recorded taxes, and preserved important information for future generations. To write, scribes used a simple tool made from reeds growing along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. One end of the reed was carefully cut into a triangular shape. Rather than scratching lines into the clay, they gently pressed the tip into the soft surface, leaving small wedge-shaped impressions. These tiny marks eventually gave the writing system its modern name. The word cuneiform comes from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge. Every symbol was built from combinations of these wedge-shaped impressions. Over time, detailed pictures gradually became abstract signs that were much faster to write. This change did not happen overnight. For hundreds of years, scribes simplified each symbol. A realistic drawing of a fish slowly transformed into a pattern of wedges. A picture of a jar became a series of geometric impressions. As cities expanded and trade became more complex, speed became increasingly important. Drawing detailed pictures for every transaction was simply too slow. Simpler symbols allowed scribes to record information quickly while maintaining accuracy. Gradually, cuneiform evolved beyond accounting. The same signs that once represented physical objects also began representing sounds. This remarkable breakthrough allowed scribes to write names, places, ideas, and eventually complete sentences. Writing was no longer just a collection of pictures. It had become a true language. Learning this system required years of training. Young students attended schools known as Idaba, meaning house of tablets. There they spent countless hours copying symbols onto wet clay under the careful supervision of experienced teachers. Education was demanding, and discipline was strict. Students practiced the same signs repeatedly until every wedge was perfectly formed. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of practice tablets filled with repeated symbols, offering a fascinating glimpse into one of the world's earliest classrooms. Becoming a skilled scribe brought great respect. While most people worked in the fields or workshops, Scribes served kings, priests, merchants, and government officials. They prepared legal contracts, recorded harvests, documented religious ceremonies, and preserved royal decisions. In a society where very few people could read or write, scribes became the guardians of knowledge itself. As centuries passed, cuneiform spread far beyond the borders of Sumer. The Akkadians adopted it, followed by the Babylonians, Assyrians, Elamites, and Hittites, each adapting the system to their own language. For nearly 3,000 years, cuneiform remained one of the most influential writing systems in the ancient world. Millions of clay tablets were created. Many disappeared beneath the sands of time, while others survived because accidental fires baked the clay, making it as durable as stone. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncovered these forgotten archives, allowing modern historians to hear voices that had been silent for millennia. What began as a practical solution for counting grain had become something far greater. Writing was no longer simply an administrative tool. It had become humanity's memory. For the first time, ideas could survive the people who created them. Every wedge pressed into wet clay carried knowledge beyond a single lifetime, ensuring that future generations could learn from the past. With the birth of cuneiform, civilization had taken one of its greatest steps forward, creating a bridge between ancient minds and the world we know today. Long before paper, ink, or books existed, these silent clay tablets became humanity's first permanent memory. Their fragile surfaces carried voices that would survive for thousands of years, waiting to be discovered by civilizations that had not yet been born. The true story of writing. Chapter 4. How writing changed the world. The invention of writing was one of the quietest yet most powerful revolutions in human history. At first, it seemed to be nothing more than a series of small marks pressed into clay. Yet those simple impressions would eventually transform the course of civilization. For the first time, knowledge no longer depended entirely on human memory. It could be preserved, shared, and passed from one generation to the next. Every new generation could build upon the discoveries of those who came before. This is why historians consider the invention of writing one of the greatest turning points in human history. One of the first areas transformed by writing was law. Before writing existed, rules were preserved through memory and oral tradition. When disputes arose, communities relied on elders or local leaders to remember customs and make judgments. But memory is imperfect. People forget details, stories change over time, and different witnesses often remember the same event differently. Writing changed this forever. Laws could now be recorded permanently, copied accurately, and displayed publicly so that everyone was expected to follow the same rules. One of the greatest examples of this new idea was the Code of Hammurabi. Around 1754 BC, King Hammurabi of Babylon ordered nearly 300 laws to be carved into a massive basalt stele. These laws covered trade, property, agriculture, family life, wages, and criminal justice. Although many of the punishments appear severe by modern standards, the true importance of the code was not the punishments themselves. Its greatest achievement was making the law permanent. Justice no longer depended entirely on memory. The rules could now survive for generations. Writing also transformed literature. People were no longer recording only taxes and inventories. They began preserving stories, beliefs, and ideas. One of the greatest surviving examples is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works in human history. Originating in ancient Sumer and later written in Babylonian, the epic tells the story of King Gilgamesh and his search for meaning after the death of his closest friend. It explores friendship, grief, mortality, and humanity's desire for eternal life. Even after thousands of years, its questions remain deeply familiar, proving that writing can preserve not only information, but also human emotion. Writing also revolutionized diplomacy. Kings no longer relied solely on spoken messages carried by messengers. They exchanged official letters written on clay tablets, allowing agreements, alliances, and negotiations to be recorded accurately. One of the greatest discoveries proving this comes from the Amarna archives in Egypt. Hundreds of clay tablets reveal diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaohs and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittite kingdom. These letters show how rulers addressed one another, exchanged valuable gifts, negotiated peace, and discussed international affairs more than 3,000 years ago. Trade expanded dramatically because of writing as well. As merchants traveled farther than ever before, trust alone was no longer sufficient. Written contracts documented agreements between buyers and sellers. Receipts confirmed payments. Inventories listed goods stored in temples and warehouses. Taxes, debts, and commercial transactions could all be carefully recorded. These written records reduced misunderstandings and allowed increasingly complex economies to flourish. Trade routes stretching from Mesopotamia across Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond carried not only valuable goods, but also the knowledge of writing itself. Science advanced in ways that would have been impossible without written records. If every generation had been forced to rely only on memory, knowledge would have been repeatedly lost. Writing allowed observations to accumulate over centuries. Scholars could preserve discoveries, correct mistakes, and improve existing knowledge rather than beginning from nothing. Astronomy became one of the earliest scientific disciplines to benefit from writing. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians, carefully observed the movements of the moon, the sun, and the visible planets. They recorded eclipses, seasonal changes, and celestial patterns on clay tablets. These observations helped determine agricultural calendars, predict seasonal cycles, and organize religious festivals. Over hundreds of years, these records became some of the world's earliest astronomical archives. Mathematics also flourished through writing. The Sumerians developed the sexagesimal, or base 60, number system. Its influence remains part of everyday life even today. Every hour contains 60 minutes. Every minute contains 60 seconds. And every circle is divided into 360 degrees. Written mathematical tables allowed engineers, architects, and surveyors to perform increasingly sophisticated calculations, making large construction projects and accurate land measurements possible. The success of writing soon spread beyond Mesopotamia. Along the Nile River, the ancient Egyptians developed their own writing system, known as hieroglyphics. Although visually very different from cuneiform, hieroglyphic writing served the same essential purpose: preserving knowledge. Temple walls, tombs, and papyrus scrolls became permanent records of religion, government, history, and daily life. Writing had become an indispensable part of Egyptian civilization. In Anatolia, the Hittites adopted Mesopotamian cuneiform for their own language. tens of thousands of clay tablets discovered in their capital, Hattusa, preserve legal documents, diplomatic treaties, religious ceremonies, and administrative records. Thanks to these remarkable archives, historians are able to reconstruct the daily life of a civilization that flourished more than 3,000 years ago. Yet one of the greatest transformations in the history of writing came with the Phoenicians. Earlier writing systems required hundreds of different symbols and years of specialized training. Phoenician merchants created a far simpler solution by developing an alphabet of approximately 22 signs, each representing a single sound rather than an entire word or idea. This innovation made reading and writing dramatically easier to learn. The Phoenician alphabet later inspired the Greek alphabet, which influenced the Latin alphabet and many modern writing systems still used throughout the world today. Looking back across history, it becomes clear that writing was far more than a method of communication. It became the foundation of law, the engine of commerce, the language of diplomacy, the memory of science, and the guardian of human thought. Kings died, empires collapsed, and magnificent cities turned to ruins. Yet the words they left behind continued to speak. Perhaps that's the greatest power of writing. A human voice eventually falls silent, but a written idea can travel across thousands of years and still inspire new generations. That is why writing is not simply one of humanity's greatest inventions. It is the timeless bridge connecting the past with the future, the true story of writing. Chapter 5. The Printing Press. When knowledge began to multiply. For thousands of years, writing preserved humanity's memory. Laws were recorded, epics were written, royal decrees were carved into stone, and scientific observations were copied onto clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and parchment manuscripts. Yet throughout all those centuries, one great obstacle remained. Knowledge could be preserved, but it could not be reproduced quickly. The only way to create a second copy of a book was to write it again by hand. For centuries, this work belonged to skilled scribes. In monasteries, royal courts, and libraries, they spent months, sometimes even years, carefully copying every page. A single mistake could require an entire sheet to be rewritten. As a result, books were incredibly rare and extremely valuable. Most people would never own a single book during their lifetime. In medieval Europe, producing one handwritten Bible could take more than 2 years and require hundreds of sheets of parchment made from animal skins. Books were treasures reserved for kings, churches, universities, and the wealthiest members of society. Knowledge existed, but it traveled painfully slowly. While Europe relied on handwritten manuscripts, an important innovation had already appeared in Asia. In ancient China, craftsmen developed woodblock printing centuries before the invention of the modern printing press. Entire pages were carefully carved into wooden blocks, covered with ink, and pressed onto paper. This method made it possible to produce many identical copies of the same page. During the 11th century, the Chinese inventor Bi Sheng introduced another remarkable idea. Instead of carving an entire page into a single block of wood, he created movable characters made from baked clay. Each character could be arranged, removed, and reused to create different texts. It was a revolutionary concept. However, because the Chinese writing system contained thousands of different characters, the method proved difficult to use on a large scale. Even so, one of history's most important ideas had been born: movable type. Nearly 400 years later, That idea would be transformed in Europe by a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg. Working in the city of Mainz during the middle of the 15th century, Gutenberg did not simply invent a new machine. He combined several existing technologies into one efficient system. He developed durable, movable metal type, created an oil-based ink that adhered perfectly to metal letters, and adapted the design of a screw press originally used for pressing grapes into a powerful printing machine. Around 1450, the first practical movable type printing press was born. Its greatest advantage was not simply speed, it was consistency. For the first time in history, hundreds of nearly identical copies of the same page could be produced quickly and accurately. Knowledge was no longer limited to a single handwritten manuscript. It could now be multiplied on an unprecedented scale. Gutenberg's most famous achievement was the Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455. It is considered one of the first major books produced with movable metal type. Its beauty and craftsmanship rivaled the finest handwritten manuscripts of its time, demonstrating that printed books could match the quality of traditional copying while being produced far more efficiently. Yet Gutenberg probably never witnessed the full impact of his invention. The printing press did far more than accelerate book production. It completely changed the speed at which ideas traveled. A book that once required years to spread across Europe could now reach hundreds or even thousands of readers within a relatively short time. Universities gained access to larger collections of books. Scholars could study each other's discoveries. Maps became more accurate. New ideas crossed borders faster than ever before. The influence of the printing press extended far beyond education. In 1517, Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread rapidly across Europe because they could be printed and reproduced in large numbers. The Protestant Reformation gained momentum, largely because printed words could travel faster than spoken ones. Over the following decades, literacy gradually increased as books became more affordable and widely available. Knowledge was no longer reserved for a privileged few. It was becoming accessible to ordinary people. Historians often argue that the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and the scientific revolution would have unfolded very differently without the printing press. Scientists could now publish their observations, allowing others to verify, challenge, and expand upon them. Every new discovery became a foundation for the next. Writing had given humanity a permanent memory. The printing press gave that memory a voice that could reach millions. No longer did an idea depend on a single scribe patiently copying every word. A single book could now be printed hundreds, thousands, and eventually millions of times. The journey that began with simple marks pressed into wet clay had entered an entirely new era. Knowledge was no longer merely preserved, it was multiplied, and for the first time in human history, the true power of an idea was measured not only by the person who wrote it, but by the countless people who could read it. The true story of writing. Chapter 6. From the typewriter to the digital age. For nearly 4 centuries, after Johannes Gutenberg perfected the printing press, the written word spread across the world at an unprecedented pace. Books became more affordable. Newspapers informed growing populations, and libraries expanded into centers of learning. Yet despite these remarkable advances, one challenge remained unchanged. Every letter, contract, and manuscript still had to be written by hand. Beautiful handwriting was considered an essential skill, but producing long documents was slow, exhausting, and often difficult to read. Governments, businesses, and scholars needed a faster and more reliable way to create written documents. During the 19th century, inventors across Europe and America searched for a solution. Their efforts eventually led to one of the most important writing tools ever created, the typewriter. Although several early designs existed, the first commercially successful machine appeared in 1874 with the Remington No. 1. For the first time, ordinary people could produce neat, uniform pages simply by pressing keys. Every letter appeared with the same size, spacing, and clarity. Documents became easier to read, easier to copy, and far more professional than most handwritten pages. The typewriter quickly transformed offices around the world. Governments adopted it for official records. Businesses used it to prepare contracts and invoices, and journalists wrote newspaper articles with unprecedented speed. A completely new profession also emerged. Thousands of men and women found employment as typists, secretaries, and office assistants, making written communication faster than ever before. By the early 20th century, the familiar sound of clicking keys had become the soundtrack of offices across much of the world. Writers also embraced the typewriter. Famous authors such as Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway, and Agatha Christie used typewriters while creating some of their most celebrated works. Revising manuscripts became easier, and publishing moved at a much faster pace than during the age of handwritten texts. Yet another revolution was already approaching. During the second half of the 20th century, computers began replacing the mechanical machines. Early computers were large, expensive, and available only to governments, universities, and major corporations. As technology improved, computers became smaller, faster, and increasingly affordable. Word processing software completely changed the writing process. For the first time, a sentence could be corrected instantly without rewriting an entire page. Paragraphs could be moved with a few simple commands. Spelling mistakes could be detected automatically. Editing became faster than writing itself. Then came the internet, and with it, another extraordinary transformation. For thousands of years, written communication had depended on physical objects such as clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, parchment, paper, and printed books. Suddenly, words no longer needed a physical service. An email could travel across the planet in seconds. Digital documents could be shared with millions of people almost instantly. Libraries containing millions of books became available through a single screen connected to the internet. Smartphones placed writing into nearly every person's pocket. Every day, billions of messages, emails, articles, and social media posts are created around the world. Never before in history have so many people written so much in such a short period of time. The invention of digital technology did not replace writing. It expanded its reach beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. Today, artificial intelligence is opening yet another chapter in the history of writing. Modern AI systems can help people organize ideas, translate languages, summarize research, and even generate complete articles within seconds. Tasks that once required days of careful work can now be completed in minutes. Yet despite these extraordinary technological advances, one truth has remained unchanged for more than 5,000 years. Every invention, From clay tablets to cuneiform, from papyrus to parchment, from the printing press to the typewriter, from computers to artificial intelligence, has served the same purpose. They have all helped human beings preserve and share knowledge. The tools have changed, but the purpose of writing has remained constant. It allows one human mind to communicate with another across distance, across generations, and even across thousands of years. Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, an anonymous scribe once pressed a small reed into wet clay, never imagining that this simple action would begin a journey leading to books, libraries, computers, and the digital world. That single impression became the first step in humanity's greatest conversation. Every page ever written, every book ever printed, every message ever sent, and every idea ever recorded traces its origin back to those first humble marks in clay. The story of writing is, in many ways, the story of civilization itself. And as long as humanity continues to create, discover, and dream, that story is still being written.